Ashish, I think I'm going to stop you here so that we can get started. Great. Thanks. Let's we'll move this away, and we'll do this. Okay, great. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. This is API-driven Django. If this wasn't the tutorial you were expecting, now is a great time to go find a different one. Before we really dive in, there's some housekeeping notes. There will be a break for a snack at 10:15. I will do my darndest to make sure that we are out for that break at exactly 10:15 so that the food doesn't go missing before we all can get there. And then lunch is going to be at 12:20. And today's lunch is apparently food trucks out on the grassy area outside the convention center. We will be breaking hopefully a little bit before 12:20 so that people can go get lunch. We may not have enough power outlets for every laptop in the room. I haven't counted. We might. If we don't, that's totally fine. At some point during this tutorial, we're going to be pairing up, and then we should only need half the number of laptop slots. Great. For most of this, as I'm talking, feel free to ask me questions. There's also going to be a more formal, easier to handle system for asking questions that we're going to talk about in a minute. But let's dive in. I'm going to introduce myself, and then my TAs are going to introduce themselves. My name is Philip James. I've been working in Django for about 7 years, I think. Wow. And specifically doing a lot with Django APIs. I currently work for a company called Patreon in San Francisco, helping creators make a living online. Before that, I worked for Stripe, helping money move around the world, and before that I worked for Eventbrite, helping power live events around the world. This is my 5th or so PyCon, and with that I'm going to turn it over to Al.
Hi everyone, I'm Al Swigert. I'm also from San Francisco, and I write Python books. I wrote Automate the Boring Stuff with Python and then a few other Python-based books. But yeah, I'll be one of the TAs.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Wow, yes, this is a great microphone. My name is Ashish Laroya. I work at Stripe, where I help grow the GDP of the internet, as we like to say. And I'm a software engineer there. I work on tools for the customer support team. I'm grateful for this chance to be a teaching assistant at this tutorial, because I have a rule for conferences. I'm not supposed to spend more than half my time with people who live in California. And I think that the fact that most of you maybe aren't from California means that this time counts toward that time. So happy to help. I've been doing Django since 2009 or so, and Python for a lot longer. And I have experience fixing Python installations on every platform you can imagine.
Great. Thank you both for being here. They're going to be kind of your primary contacts for questions or help throughout the tutorial, because I'm mostly going to be up here. And so with that, let's talk about format a little bit. My personal goal with this tutorial is first and foremost to make sure that you're having a good time. All of this content, the slides and the GitHub repo that we will be working from, are going to be available online after the tutorial, and I'll send out an email to the whole class saying, hey, here's where you can get the resources. If you feel like you are struggling for any reason or not keeping up, don't worry about it. You're welcome to come after, ask me questions. I'm here for most of the days of sprints as well. We can schedule a time to work through it one-on-one. All of that is fine. But to dive into what the format is going to be like today, we're going to operate on the buddy system. So after I'm done with this slide, I'm going to ask people to kind of pair up, and there's going to be some guide on how to pair up. Ideally, there's going to be, I think, about 10 sessions over this tutorial where we kind of break into doing things as a pair. Switch pairs back and forth so that both people get some chance programming, but ideally it's all going to happen on one laptop. So when we get together as pairs, we're going to talk about, you and your pair are going to talk about whose laptop you're going to be using. We're going to be using a sticky note system. So once you're in pairs, every pair is going to get a red and a green sticky note. How this works. If you are having trouble, you can take the red sticky note and put it on the back of your laptop. And then one of two things will happen. Either a TA will notice it and come ask if you're okay and if you need any help, at which point take down the red sticky note. Or if I see it and it's an okay time for a break, I might say, hey, do you have a question? If not, talk to a TA. That's the red sticky note. The green sticky note is how we're going to determine whether the class as a whole needs more time during the programming breaks. There are going to be, like I said, about 10 programming breaks. When you and your pair feel like you've completed the work, like you're ready to move on, put a green sticky note on your laptop, and that means, okay, I can look at the room, say, okay, it looks like the class is mostly done, we can move on from there. And as I said before, you're going to be able to get all of this at the end. My contact info will be available, and you're welcome to ask me questions afterwards about any of this material. So with that, can I get a show of hands who already has pipenv and Python 3 working on their laptop? Cool. That's great. Keep your hands up for a second. If you don't have your hand up right now, look at the people who do have their hands up in case, because those are probably great people to be pairing with. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take like 2 minutes, and we're going to get into pairs. You can organize yourselves into pairs however you wish. It could be the people sitting next to you right now. Some of you are probably going to have to move around. We might need some people to move up because of how crowded we are in the back. But form into pairs, introduce yourselves, say what you're most looking forward to about PyCon. And we'll take about 2 minutes for this. Yeah. I didn't get Pippin installed. What? I didn't get Pippin installed. You have it on your machine? All right, well, I guess we'll figure it out over the course of the day. Thanks. Take one. If you're just Hi, what we're doing right now is we're getting into pairs because we're going to be pair programming throughout this. Awesome. So it could also be a 3, but find someone who might be unpaired and try to get into a pair group. We're going to take about 1 more minute. Is anyone currently unpaired? If you are currently unpaired, raise your hand. Is anyone willing to take a third person in their group? Would you two be willing to take a third? Okay, great. Then we'll have the 3 of you just work right here. Perfect. Okay, great. I'm going to bring us all back together. Our lovely TAs are going to keep passing out sticky notes, but I think we're going to move on with the tutorial for now. Hopefully you both got a great chance to introduce yourself to your buddy, to your pair for the next couple hours. Oh, the room is quieting. Yes, I like this. This is great. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to keep moving. Hopefully you all met a new friend or learned more information about an old friend, and you're ready to start pairing together. So let's quickly talk about some pairing best practices that are going to hopefully make this go better for all of us. I really like pair programming. It's a habit I got into when I was working at Eventbrite. And one of the things that I like best about pair programming is I normally learn more about whatever we're working on as a group when I have someone next to me who's kind of asking questions, pointing things out, or when I'm watching someone else type, I get to learn the structures and the format that they use, and that's often fascinating and really insightful for me. And one of the ways that I've had good pairing experiences in the past is by following some best practices. One of those best practices, which these are all suggestions, they will help you have a more pleasant experience, but we're not going to enforce them necessarily. The less familiar person should type first. If you think you're a Django API REST expert, then maybe give your partner the first pair. And again, we're going to be hopefully switching off with each pairing session. Like I said, switch pairs to different sessions. One machine, one set of hands. You know, strict extreme programming agile says you have 2 keyboards and 2 mice, like you're wizards. 1 keyboard, 1 set of hands. Please don't grab the computer away from your partner. Let's build a nice, fostering, welcoming environment while we're here together. Great. I'm going to keep going. What are our goals as a group for today? Our goals for a group today are to build a Django API first app for collecting civic government data. That app, we're going to talk more about the specs later, but it's basically going to be a way to kind of track votes at city government with an API and an OK front end. I'm not a front-end engineer. That app is going to use the same code for the API endpoints as well as the rendered templates, which is hopefully one of the reasons why you all are here, and have that app let anyone who wants read the data, but only authorized users write the data. And so what are we going to be using to build these things? The first thing we're going to be using is Django. It's in the title. Hopefully people in this room have a little bit of familiarity with Django. If not, that's totally fine. There's not a ton of necessarily Django-specific content. A lot of it is Django plus Django REST-framework, and we will have time to go over anything that is Django-specific. And the reason that I use Django and that I really love using Django is that it provides a structure that makes it easier for me to write code with others. One of the great things about Python is that insight that Guido had many years ago, which that code is read way more than it is written. And having worked both on Django web apps and non-Django web apps, a thing I can say conclusively is that having a framework that strongly encourages a structure makes your code much easier to read and much more collaborative when you're working on a team. And ultimately, most of us are going to be working on teams for most of our programming lives. There's a bunch of other reasons I like Django. It's a very batteries-included web framework. I've very rarely had to like reach for something to build a web application that wasn't in Django somewhere. But the one kind of exception to that is building really nicely composed RESTful APIs. I don't think we need to get into a formal definition of REST. It is a methodology for how you think about APIs, accessing resources over the internet, more or less, where a resource might map to what, if you're more familiar with Django than building APIs, you can think of a resource as like the model. And so a REST API is, how do I expose my models to the internet in a way that makes some sort of sense? And the tool that we're going to be using to add API capabilities to our basic Django app is Django REST-framework. So talking a bit about the app that we're actually going to build, we're going to call it Civic API. It's a Django app to track votes taken at civic government meetings. It's going to be pretty straightforward. The requirements from the client are that it can track the subject of the vote, when the vote was taken, and what the vote count was, how many ayes or nays there was for the vote. So pretty, hopefully, straightforward, hopefully something that we can accomplish in this, the few hours we have together today. Obviously, there's a lot of places we could go with it, but the first requirement from the client is tracking votes, when they were taken, what the vote was about, and how many people voted yes versus how many people voted no. It does need to support rich front-end clients that are going to be written by another contractor, and needs to support API clients. This is effectively a CRUD app on votes taken. And CRUD is an unfortunate acronym that actually powers, it describes a lot of how things happen on the internet. It stands for create, retrieve, update, and destroy. And there's nothing, the reason I call CRUD an unfortunate acronym is because we associate CRUD with there's a negative connotation there. Like we say an app is cruddy, and it's like, well, that's not very nice. When really, most of the web apps that we use and most of the things that we interact with on the internet are doing this. They might be doing some other business logic, but most of what we do is creating, retrieving, updating, and destroying models across our web apps. Any quick questions before we dive in, start doing a little bit of setup and housekeeping, and then start going with some code? Great, I'm just going to keep going. So it sounds like most people already have the environment set up, but I'm going to kind of walk through it and walk through some of the environment choices that I made as we get started here. The first major piece is Pippin. Pippin is still new-ish software, and a lot of people, when Pippin gets introduced, go, another Python package manager. Don't we have like 10 of these? And the answer is, maybe. The reason that I like Pippin, the reason we're using it today, and the reason I'm recommending it, is that it is the best one that I have used, and it provides an experience most like other modern package managers in a lot of ways. I think that there is a lot that Python can learn from other programming communities. One of the programming communities that I really admire the package management philosophy of is Node and how NPM works. I don't particularly enjoy writing Node code, but every time I use NPM, I'm like, boy, there are some things here that I wish Python had in its package infrastructure. And so pipenv is getting us closer to a much easier story to tell around installing and sharing packages. So we're going to run through some instructions together. This is one of the few instances where we're going to kind of be doing things together. Most other things is going to be breaking into a pairing session, you attempting to code a solution, and then me showing the solution that I got. Your solution does not have to match my solution, but mine is the one that's going to be available on the web on GitHub at the end. So we're going to start by making a directory called Civic API and going into that directory, and then setting up a pipenv environment and installing Django with it. Give everybody kind of a minute to try to do that with your pair. Once you're done, put up a green sticky on your laptop. Hopefully this is going to be a quick step, but if not, that's totally fine. Oh, yay, I'm starting to see some green stickies. This is great. One thing I will call out is if you're having internet problems and you already had a environment set up with Django and Django REST-framework, you don't have to make a new folder. This will just make the code examples make a little bit more sense. Hey, what's up? So to deactivate a pipenv environment, if you're in the shell, exit. If you're not in the shell, pipenv is dependent on the directory that you're in. So it'll just do it. Yeah. Yeah, pipenv knows what directory you're in, knows if in that directory tree there is a pipenv file, and will just use that same environment in the directory tree. It's really nice, yeah. If you've done Python packaging before, there's a lot of pain points that pipenv solves. Looking for more green stickies once people have their environment going. Also, feel free to use red stickies to say, hey, I'm having an issue. it's not working on your laptop, but it is working on your pair's laptop, please use your pair's laptop so that way we can keep moving with the tutorial. Looking for more green stickies. Do people have this going, or are we doing good? Okay. I'm seeing a majority of green stickies, and so I'm going to keep moving, but you're welcome to be working on this in the background while we keep moving with this section. So green stickies down so that we can keep moving. And while people are picking this up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Pippin, and then we're going to start working with Django instead of our environment. So one of the cool things about Pippin is that it kind of has two, you could think of them as modes of execution. There's Pippin run, and so I could do something like Pippin run python manage.py, if you're familiar with Django, and that's going to run the python manage.py command in the Pippin environment. And so I don't have to go into a virtual environment if I want to use the one that Pippin's installed, which is really nice. But for this section, for this tutorial, I'm actually going to mostly use Pippin shell. And so Pippin shell does give you a virtual environment that you can leave with exit like you would with a, or deactivate the way you would with a standard virtual environment. And so we're going to do our commands in Pippin shell so that everything we're doing is in the environment that we just set up. So we're going to do this. We're going to do Pippin shell and then Django admin.py start project Civic API. And we're going to take a couple minutes to get that going. Yeah, if you left your green sticky up from before, take it down because we want to make sure that the green stickies accurately reflect what's going on. And the second part of this command, Django admin.py start project Civic API dot, that dot here means create it in the existing directory rather than creating a whole other directory structure for Civic API. We're already in the Civic API directory. We don't need like 3 layers deep of Civic API. So when you have that start project started, go ahead and put up your green sticky. Fabulous. We're moving a little slow to start, and that's fine. We're going to be picking up speed really fast. Cool, I'm seeing green stickies, so we're going to keep moving so that we can get to the interesting coding bits. There's going to be more time to get environment set up. Don't worry about it too much. We're going to start a votes app. Yeah, so both of these commands, this Django admin.py start project Civic API dot, and then the Django admin.py start app votes should both be run in the same place. Yeah, and you should have a manage.py file in there. Hi. Yep. Sure. Yeah, so to clarify for people who are newer, this command here creates the Django project, which is the kind of overarching project structure. this command here creates the votes app within the project. Unfortunately, if you're not super familiar with Django, we don't have a ton of time to go into Django specifics, but I'm totally available after the course for questions. And then we're going to migrate to get our database created with our kind of core models going. And then one more setup step. And then soon we'll be able to actually run a server, which will be great. Django creates that. And then when you create your super user, you can use whatever email you want. That's totally fine. And then the last thing is Python manage.py run server. So let me do something real quick. I'll put that back in just a second. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to put that there. Whoop. Let's make this a little smaller. So I'm going to run through the commands here just so we can kind of see what expected output would be. Yeah. What's up?
We're struggling with our environment until 10 seconds ago, and so they don't know what command you ran.
Yeah. So the command that I ran to get here was pippin-3 install Django, this command here. And then that got the pipenv running, so I'm going to do pipenv shell. Once I'm in the shell, I can do django admin.py. Hilariously, I always have to look this up. Start project, not create project. Start project, Civic API dot. That dot is hilariously super important. It's going to create the project here rather than a subdirectory. Okay, if I do an ls here, I see that I have my pip file lock, my Civic API folder, my manage.py. That Python manage.py is pretty important. It's going to let us start things later, but for now I can do django admin.py start app votes. Okay, so then I'm going to do Python manage.py migrate. This is going to create the database because we're just using a local SQLite database and make sure the models are correctly applied in it. Great, going well so far. We're going to do Python manage.py create super user. I'm just going to leave, yep, Fildini sounds great. Fildini at fildini.net. Hilariously, you can put whatever you want in here as long as it's got an @ Django doesn't care too much. password, super secret password again. Okay, great. And then the last thing that I'm going to do here, and I already have an example running in the background, is python manage.py run server. And if you do that, and then go to a localhost 8000 window, you should see this. If you're not here, if you can't see this by going to localhost 8000, let me show you the command that got you there. If you run this and you don't see this on your browser, this is a great time to put up a red sticky. And by the way, when I say if you don't see it, this should be you and your pair, right? Like if one of you has it working, then we have to move forward with just the one of you, sorry. But I'm seeing a lot of green stickies, which makes me think that a lot of people have this, and that's great. Fantastic. And one way that you can test that things are doing what they want to do is by going to admin, where you can see if I were to log out, log in again, I can log in with that user I just created. And pretend you can't see votes because that's not there yet, but you should see this bit, the groups and the users. If you're having questions, put up a red sticky. Since I'm seeing a lot of green stickies, I'm probably going to keep going. Yep, I'm going to keep moving, yeah. That's a great question. It's migrating it into the database that you've created locally. Let's talk about that question at the end. Okay. We're going to keep going. There's a lot we're trying to get done today. Sorry about that. Again, just so we're clear, get as far as you can. There will be breaks built in to do more work and to get things moving even farther, but I'm going to keep going for now. That's so weird. Yeah. We can give it a couple more minutes. Yeah, I'll try to help out. As is quite common, Windows is the bane of Python's existence. But we're going to keep moving because I want to see how far we can get before that 10:15 break. OK, so check that you have something in admin. You should have been able to log into the admin by creating the super user and moving in. Let's talk for a minute about the vote model that we're going to be creating. Like I said, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to have a subject, which is a required string, vote taken, which is a date and time required, eyes, as in yes votes, which is an integer that's required. Sorry, that should be not required. Whoops. 1 second. So subject is a string that is required. Vote taken is a date and time that is required. Eyes is an integer not required, and nays is an integer not required. And what we're going to do, and if you can't get this in the next little bit, don't worry, I'll be showing you the code, and you can copy it down from there. Take some time with your partner to make the vote model in your models.py. So let me show you. Let's get to the right place. So you're going to make this, with the exception that this should be not required, not required. And you're going to add the votes model to your models.py in the votes folder that you just created with start app. Yeah, that all checks out. Except if they need the details on, but I can make it bigger. And we're going to take about 5 to 10 minutes to get through this. And again, I will be showing code for this, so if you don't get it perfect the first time, don't worry about it. When you feel like you might have it, put up a green sticky note. If you feel like you're having serious trouble, put up a red sticky note. If I see a lot of red sticky notes or a lot of green sticky notes, I'll go to the code faster and we can go from there. the red stickies are there for you. If you're done, the green stickies are there for you. If you're done, and we're waiting on some others, you can make sure that you can see that new model in admin, which might take an extra step that I'll talk about when we show code. Alternatively, there's tons of ways to see that the migration happened successfully. Oh, I forgot a step. My apologies. Yeah, there's Python manage.py make migrations. No, don't autocorrect it. So by this point, by the time we're done, and we're going to be done in a minute or so here, we'll give some extra time. We'll probably stop at about 9:50 for this section. You should have your project, your votes app, in your models.py. You're going to have a vote model. You're going to add votes to installed apps in Civic API settings.py. You're going to make migrations, and then you're going to migrate it. And if you're having trouble, that's totally fine. I think that we have some people in the room who are slightly more experienced with Django. And if you and your pair are both having trouble with it, we might do some rearranging so that we can pair people who have more Django experience with people who are a little newer. And again, all this code will be available at the end. So we're going to spend about 1 more minute on this, and then I'm going to show the code. So if you didn't finish it in this time, that's totally fine. I'm going to show you the code that I came up with to make this work. Yeah, all of the complete code base for the finished version with like commits at each step will be available online, as well as I will make the entire slides available online when we're done. If you're not keeping in perfect tempo, that's totally fine and understandable. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of this lovely lull to show the code that I came up with for doing this same piece. Oop, oh, right. Yep. Okay. So let's start with, crap. Great. Let's start with the models.py file. This is the model that I came up with for vote. That def stir is extra. You can, is it? How hard, can people in the back see this? How hard is that to see? I'm getting some thumbs up. Great. We're getting a shake. Okay, let's see what I can do about that. Actually, let me see. Preferences. Color. Well, I can also try a different color scheme. Is that better? Great. We can make this code bigger as well. Did that get any better? Hey, Richard, can we get the lights down a little bit more in the front? So again, you don't have to worry about the stir bit at the bottom. That's just kind of a nicety to make it display nicer in admin and some other places. But hopefully this is recognizable to some of you, this is a Django model where I'm using a car field for the subject because we don't necessarily have bounds on how long the subject is going to be, a date time field for vote taken, where I'm giving it a default, and then ayes and nays. Meanwhile, in my settings.py, which I will make smaller so that people can see it, again, we don't have to worry about stir so much. In my settings.py, I have this installed apps, which everyone should have in their settings.py, which is in Civic API settings.py. And I've added votes to the bottom so that we know that so that the Django project knows that the votes app exists. Nope. And then from here in my directory, in my shell, is where I would run python manage.py make migrations, all one word, and then python manage.py migrate. I'm going to leave this up for a couple more minutes, and then we're probably going to move on. One other thing that, whoop, that's not correct. One other thing that I will do, because I don't think it's a ton of code. Make migrations and then migrate. In votes admin.py, which is also a file that should already exist, I've just got these 3 lines, and adding these 3 lines to my admin.py will make the votes model show up in the admin site. Ah, crap. Once you run make migrations and then migrate, and then unfortunately one of the few things that I dislike about Django is in your admin.py, you do need, oh wow, you probably can't see that highlighting at all, I'm sorry about that. You do need these lines in your votes admin.py file to make it show up in the admin site. I will try to move that up. Let's see if I can move it to like, yeah. And again, all of this code with all of the like checkouts at each step is going to be available online at the end. But for now, I'm seeing some green stickies, so I might move on. If you're uncomfortable with me counting your green sticky, take it down. Sure. If you want to see the dunder string method, let me rearrange some things and see if I can get that for you. So we're going to put this up in the corner so people can see it. And then my dunder stir method is a little more complex, but it makes for a pretty picture. And we're going to give about 1 more minute, and then I'm going to move on. Migrate. Make migrations and then migrate. Python manage.py migrate. Yep. Cool. And so if we've done all of that, what we should end up with is a site that looks something like this, where I have groups and users. Those are kind of given to us by Django. And then I have this votes model here, which I can click add, and then add like a a vote that was taken. And everyone in this room, all I think 55-ish of us, obviously voted that yes, Django is the best. No one voted against it, because no one could possibly believe that Django is not the best, of course. And then you see that that vote was created there. So if we've gotten to that point, and we can have some time during the break if you haven't gotten to that point to help people get to that point, but we're going to assume that that's where we are, and we're going to move on from there so that we can keep driving on what we're trying to accomplish today. Okay, so we've shown the code. So now we have a model, and we're going to talk about views. And this is really where the meat is. We're actually done with the model. We're basically done with the admin site for the rest of this tutorial. We're going to talk about views. And views are how you take data that lives in the database and render it to a browser or render it to JSON, basically expose it to the rest of the world. And if you were following the Django tutorial and trying to do this Civic API app, you might use Django generic views. Django generic views are class-based views where the Django team has put a bunch of common operations for operating on models into these very simple class-based views that only require a couple lines of code. And they're pretty great, actually. You can do creation and updating. You can do listing and deleting. You can do all kinds of things with Django generic views on models. But Django views, the way they're written today, assume that you are rendering a web page. So if we wanted to create a view that lists and create votes, we would probably need a Django Views generic list view, a Django Views generic edit create view, a template file, update the URLs, and probably a model form, because Django wants to have some sort of intermediate representation for taking things from the website and turning that into things that the database understands. And so we could do that. We're not going to do that, but we could do that right now in terms of we could create a Django generic view for accessing our models and follow something that kind of feels like the Django tutorial. But then once we had that done, we would have to start thinking about, well, wait, what about an API? The thing about Django views, class-based views and function-based views, the way they're written today, is they're written from mostly the perspective of, I am going to be rendering a template. That's not strictly true, but most of the thought that's gone into building Django is thinking, I am going to be rendering from a database model to some sort of HTML. And so most of the time, in the past, when we've tried to add an API to Django or wanted to have a Django API, we've kind of had two options. Add separate API views, which isn't that great because now you're maintaining two sets of logic, or try to munge JSON responses into existing views. Django has some facilities for returning JSON from a view, but it's not kind of natively supported, and it's not sort of natively supported in the generic views that we want to be using to make our lives easier for dealing with models. And so when we're going through this, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what's better for the client who's asking us to build this for them, and what's better for the developer? And I take the approach that if you don't have to duplicate your code, if you can get the best of both worlds where you can render nice templates but still have kind of an API first mentality and use the same views for both, then you're probably going to be happier in the long run. So why not start with the API? This also helps in the world that we're all moving into, and Django especially is moving into, where it's getting rarer and rarer that the sites you're building in Django are going to be using the full Django rendering context as the front end for your app. Most of us, I know most of my work has been Django or some Python library is powering an API that is spitting JSON to the front end or just sending JSON in some form. And then there's a React app or an Angular app or some other rich JavaScript front end that is operating on that data in the API. But for quick prototyping, especially if you're trying to prototype what an endpoint might look like or what a view might look like, you want to have the full featured ability of the Django template engine. We can get the best of both worlds, and that's what we're going to dive into next. So we're going to start playing with Django REST-framework. And hopefully, you'll see that immediately, to create that same view, a view that lists and create votes, we need way less things. All we need to get going is a model serializer for the vote and a REST-framework generics list create API view. So what do I mean by a model serializer? Serializers are similar to Django forms in that they are taking data from the user, running some sort of validation against it, running some logic to turn that into something the database understands through the model, and then saving or updating that model. But serializers also do something different kind of in the other direction, which is they will take the representation of a model, the model object, and turn that into something that can be turned into JSON, something that can be turned into HTML. Model serializers kind of sit between the view and the model to make sure that the representations, the data moving back and forth, make sense to each part of the stack. And so here's an example, which we'll leave up for the next pair exercise. Here's an example of a model serializer. So let's talk about this for a second. This is an account serializer from serializers.model-serializer. There's this class meta, which is hopefully familiar from doing Django model forms, where we're saying this is the model that we're operating on. In this case, it's account. And these are the fields that we want to expose. Similar to Django model forms, Django REST-framework serializers operate on the idea that you can either say explicitly what fields you want to expose or explicitly what fields you don't want to expose. And it's kind of a fail open, fail close in terms of what you want to expose on your model. Generally, we prefer to fail closed or to specify exactly what fields we want on the serializer rather than letting the serializer kind of like pick everything we don't say not to use. And so this pattern, model equals account, fields equals ID account name users created, is the pattern that we want to be using when we make our vote serializer. And so basically from now until the break, and I'll call people out for the break, we're going to be working with our pairs to make a model serializer for our vote model. I'll be putting this up on the next slide as a guide. If you found that last exercise that we did was like way more Django than you are used to, that's totally fine. I recommend you ask around because I think we have an interesting kind of mix of people who have done Django before and people who haven't done Django before. Unfortunately, we don't really have the capacity this morning to be kind of an intro to Django tutorial. We're hoping that there are enough Django people with Django proficiency in the room that we can move on to the API stuff faster. So if you were finding that the Django parts of the last pair exercise were a little much, totally feel free to ask around. Or again, all of this code with the checkouts at every step is going to be available online afterwards. And I'll show the code again probably after the break. So with that, I'm going to rework this slide, but this is what we're going to be trying to do basically between now and the break. We're going to make sure that Django REST-framework is installed. We're going to be adding REST-framework to the Django app in the settings.py like we did previously. We're going to try to make a model serializer for vote in the Votes app. And if we have time, feel free to take that last one as optional. We're going to try to write a test to verify the serialized data. And again, I'll be showing code for all of this after the break. I will call out at 10:15-ish that the break is happening. We'll break for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll come back together around 10:25, 10:30, and we'll really start digging into the API side of things. Cool. So let me rework the slides that you see both at the same time. Give me a second. And then we will get going. Hi, Ashish.
Hi. If you can, hit the file names or directories for the bullet points, that would make a little difference.
Okay, great. Yep, the slides are coming back in just a second. Until the files come back, if you were finding that the last section was a little Django heavy, maybe ask around to the other pair groups around you and see if someone else has more Django expertise. And here we go, hopefully. Okay, great. Cool. So there is an example. You might look at the Django REST-framework guide at the bottom. You are going to be, let me add that as code actually. That'll make our lives easier. Yep, let me get that for you. And so you're going to be making a serializer that looks something like this serializer, but instead the model is going to be vote. Next to the steps, that's the file you're probably working in. Make it clear, that account serializer, you're making one like that for the votes model, but that is not what you're copy pasting. This is an example. just so we're all on the same page, in about a minute and a half, I'm going to say, hey, it's time for the break and the snack. You are welcome to stay here and keep working on things, but if you're feeling hungry, or you want a coffee, or you want to stretch your legs, or use the restroom, we're going to do that in about a minute. Okay, great. Just so that no one misses it who wants it, the snack is going to be available out where coffee was this morning right now. I'm going to call right now that we're going to take a break for about 10 minutes. If you need to use the restroom, get up and do that. If you need to get a drink or you want to get a snack. When we come back from the break, I'm going to be showing the code for this, and then we're going to be diving more into the API views, including how to get that view that renders both a template and a JSON response. we're going to get started again in about a minute and a half. Meanwhile, enjoy the comedic stylings of Ashish Laroya. Under the leg. Yeah. Over the shoulder might be easier. Mm. Yep. uh, so now I'm going to show the code that corresponds to this, which is great. So let's start with, so in votes, we've made a new file called serializers.py. And oh man, that always happens. This window, I tell you. There we go. This file is hopefully straightforward and not too complex. Let me make it a little wider so that we can get it all on the right line. Yeah, there we go. So we have a vote serializer that's inheriting from model serializer. The meta is pointing at the vote model. And the fields that I've chosen is basically all the fields that exist on the model, because there's nothing that's really private per se when it comes to our API. Now, to get that working in our settings.py, hopefully this file looks a little familiar from last time, we needed to add REST framework to our installed apps. You didn't need to do any migration this time because we aren't really updating a model, we're updating the serializer. And then there's a couple ways to test this to make sure that it's working. If we have time at the end, I will show how to test it from the shell. The way that I tested it is by actually writing a test. And so I'm going to show that test now. There's also a test for the model that we can ignore for now. And we'll just look at the test for the serializer. See if I can pull this in a bit, try to see all on the same screen at the same time. Probably not going to work very well. Oh well. And so this is the test that I wrote to prove that it was working the way I thought it should, using Django test case, pulling in the serializer, creating a model, serializing that model, and this is also how you could test it in the Django shell, is by importing your serializer and serializing it on serializing a model instance. And then basically checking the properties. There's a bunch of different ways that I could have tested this. This one works for me just to prove that it's like, am I getting the same thing back when I serialize it? This is almost a test of model serializer, so it's not really the most useful test, but it at least lets me know in the future if something has changed and therefore needs to be corrected. Not going to spend a ton more time on this because I really want us to get to the actual views, but are there any immediate questions about this? Yeah, what's up? Do I have to list the ID in the vote? So let's look at the serializer again. the only things that are going to end up in the API responses, as we'll see in a minute, are the things that are in this fields list, right? And that's also, because we're using model serializer, the only things that I can send to create new votes. This will get clearer once we've done the view, but if you want to access or set a property on a model using a model serializer, you basically have to list it in fields. So to kind of answer a long way of answering your question, yes, I had to enumerate ID and vote taken if I wanted to be able to see those or set those. Cool. We're going to charge right along because I want to be conscious of time. We've got about 2 hours with each other, and it's been a magical journey for me so far. I hope it's been one for you. So I've shown the code. We're going to be using two Django REST-framework generic views in this tutorial. The first one is the list create API view. If you've used APIs before, where let's say there's like a slash events endpoint, if you say worked for an event company that wanted to list all of the events that was happening in your area, they might have an API endpoint slash events that would list everything. But if you made a post request against that endpoint, it would also create a new event. We're going to do something similar, where we're going to have a slash votes endpoint, and we are going to, that endpoint is going to list the votes that we have, as well as allow us to post to that endpoint to create a new vote. As an example, just to kind of like walk through this example, and this is not the view that we are creating, but this is a sample view that's going to look very, very similar. We have this generics, so I'll show the full import statement in a minute, but it's, from REST framework .views import generics, and then generics.list create API view. You're passing it a query set, which is the models that it should be looking for when it's serving or adding to this view, and then a serializer class. And that's kind of part of the power of Django REST framework, is that it feels very Django generics-like, in that this is all you need to get that working view. So let me get the import statement, and I'll pull everything together. Meanwhile, if you're still copying that, you can still copy that. 1 second. Nope, not that one. Okay. Okay, great. So we have the import statement, and then this is an example. This is not the exact view that you're creating, but you're going to add a vote list similar to this user list view to our votes views.py file. You have a views.py file in your project. You're going to add the view to the urls.py, and you're going to run server. And this is where, since we're at a breakpoint, if you would, how many people would prefer that I show the code at the beginning, and how many people enjoy figuring it out? Okay, I'm getting some figuring it out, which is great. So we're going to spend, again, about 10 minutes-ish working on this. We might cut it short if I'm seeing a lot of confusion. And then I will show the code that corresponds and makes all this work. we're going to transition right now to me showing the code for this section. If you're still working on it, that's fine. And I just want to call out, hopefully you're here and having some enjoyment and learning some things, but the most important thing is that you're learning something. There's no quiz. You don't get judged on whether or not you finish by the end. So if you feel like you're moving too slow and not keeping up, seriously don't worry about it. There's no judgment. We're not going to grade you at the end. You get to grade me, in fact. So if you're moving slowly, maybe it's my fault. But for now, we're going to show off the code that corresponds to this section. Cool. So in my views.py, actually, let me close a bunch of these windows first because they are just in our way. They're not doing anything useful, as it turns out. Let me move that back for a second. That's not useful. That's not useful. Cool. Here's something that is useful. So this is the entirety of the view that I have for getting our list create API view. And if I look at my Civic API urls.py, I will show you what I've added to get a working URL for this view, which looks something like. So I did something that you can or you don't have to do. I imported views from Vote as Vote views because I like kind of using imports as a reminder to myself of what I'm looking at. And so in this URL patterns, you already had a list, a route, a path to the admin views. And what we've done here is we've added a votes path. And so here I'm calling vote views, which corresponds to this vote list.asView, because it's still a way under the hood of generics list create API view. It's still a Django class-based view, right? There are multiple subclasses going on here. And so I had someone during the last session, during this just previous pair session, ask me, wait, what's actually going on here? And so this might be familiar. These two lines might be familiar if you're familiar with kind of like Django model form views. But to take a minute and talk about what's actually happening, your vote list is inheriting from list create API view. List create API view is looking for a query set and a serializer class and then taking care of most of the view logic for you. There's another way of writing this view, which is writing each method handler, get, post, list, create, etc., writing each of those individually, and then calling the query set in each one, and calling the serialization on the query set in each one. This list create API view is a generic. It's a shortcut that kind of condenses all the common logic, so all you need to tell it is what's the query set that I'm looking at, and what's the serializer I should use to inflate and deflate that query set. And we can see that that works. Let me make sure that my run server is run servering and not run failing. Fail servering? Fail servering. And so we can see if we now go to /votes here, what we should see is, yeah, this is the Django REST-framework, what they call the browsable API view. It is a template provided by Django REST-framework that shows you like what the output would be in JSON. And also, I've got a bunch of votes that I've created already, but it'll also let me create a vote down here. This is really neat, and so when you see this, you might be tempted to think, well, wait, if I have this rendered template, then I'm done, right? Like I wanted to do a rendered version, HTML version of a JSON API endpoint. And some things that are true about this is, one, this is actually pretty hard to customize. You'd have to kind of dig deep into the code of Django REST-framework, and you'd have to work really hard to get it to look like the prototype of whatever you want to do. Plus, there's a lot that's going on here that you probably don't want to expose as part of a prototype or don't want to expose to the average user of the site. And so there's a couple more things that I want to show about this before we move on to the next step. Hopefully, you got here. Let me move this out of the way so you can kind of like see how we got here. Again, we created a vote list view, we wired that up to our URLs, and then when we went to /votes, we got this. A cool trick that I will show is if I do format in as a, it's very hard to see because the browser is so small, as a URL param to the view, and I do something like format equals JSON, I can see the JSON representation raw. And that's going to become super useful in a moment when we add an actual rendered template that we control to this view. So if I go back and do format equals API, then I see what I saw before. Yeah. Yeah, right here. No, if you so the so this vote list here, if I don't have the as view, and this actually came up for another student as well, if I just have the vote list, then what you're passing to the URL is the class, but you're not passing the URL anything that it can operate on. This as view is a method that lives in the parent class of list create API view, and it knows how to handle an incoming request from Django, do the right internals, and then return the right response. So that's definitely necessary. No, so that we'll right. So the way that you get the JSON is by specifying that you want the JSON, or by telling your view actually only ever return the JSON. And we're going to get into how that would happen in the next section. But before we do that, I want to do something else. Yeah, what's up? Oh, my general feeling on it is that both Django and Django REST-framework provide these generic views to help you code faster and do the right thing. There are cases, and we'll actually see a case in a little bit, hopefully, where overwriting one of the internal methods is something that you need to do. But normally, you only want to do that when you have a need to override some of the behavior. The reason that I wouldn't specify each of these individually on all the views is because I don't trust myself not to forget some key thing, whereas the maintainers of these libraries are very smart to start with. They've written a lot of tests, secondly. And thirdly, they've had a lot of eyes on their code, making sure that they don't forget the things they need in each of the methods. And so that's kind of the power of frameworks like this, and kind of the power of open source is there's like a checklist if I were writing these views from scratch, where I would have to remember every step on the checklist. Instead, I could just use their checklist and let the magic happen. Cool. Let me, what's going to be, actually, oh, I know. So Python. Cool, is that working and running? Okay, I'm going to pull a shell over because I want to show something that if this doesn't work, I make no apologies. Live demos are hard. But what I'm going to do here, come on. What? I'm going to make it bigger, Ashish. How about even bigger? Okay, now I'm going to, cool. Can people see that Python shell? Pretty reasonably. Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to do import requests, which hopefully is a library people are familiar with. And then I'm going to do r equals, oh wait, there's a screen right here I can look at instead. What am I making my life harder for? Requests.get, HTTP, localhost 8000. So this is another way that we can kind of prove that our views are doing what we want them to do, because we can look at them as APIs, right? And so if I look at R, is a 404. Ah, because I forgot that the path is actually /votes. Live demos, nothing like them. And then if I do r.json, what I would expect before I hit enter on this is I would expect the JSON representation of that page that I just saw rendered. Hooray, that worked. Pretty amazing. Second try. We're going to do one more, which is we're going to do a post request to show that we can still kind of create votes the way we would expect to using an API, you know, quote unquote, normally. So I'm going to do data equals subject. This tutorial is amazing, with lots of exclamation points. And then for vote taken, because I have no desire to like figure out a time string the hard way, I'm just going to copy one of the existing time strings. We're going to say eyes And notice that I'm having to format this kind of like a Python dict because it's going to be translated from a Python dict into JSON that gets posted to the server. And so all of us agree that this tutorial is amazing, except Ashish. So I'm making a post request here against that same endpoint where I just did the listing. Data subject, this tutorial is amazing. This is when the vote was taken. We mostly agree this tutorial is amazing. Ashish is unconvinced, but I think he'll be convinced by the end. And a closed curly brace. Yeah, thank you. See, pair programming, it works. Okay, what do I get for R? Uh-oh. Oh, no. Okay, so what was the JSON here? What did I do wrong? Oh, R is a 500. R dot text? What happened here? Wah, wah. Wow. Yep. Super useful. Great. This is exactly what I wanted. Cool. Let me see if I can if I can look harder at the code that I gave and see if I can notice any problems. Data, subject, vote taken. Here? I don't believe that, but I'll try it. Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm not exactly certain why the post isn't working. We'll move on from that for now. It shouldn't need to be. You should be able to. In fact, wait, I have. Totally possibly, but I just remembered that I have an example. Oh my god, if it is the trailing slash, I'm going to like. So let me copy one that theoretically worked before. Amazing. Wow. Computers, man. If you want to learn, by the way, I'll take this time to say, if you want to learn more about all the ways computers and the humans that use them can fail hilariously, Ashish and I are giving a talk tomorrow on timing attacks. So this response 201 is what we would have hoped to happen. 201 is the HTTP code that means created. And so now if we look at our.json, what we should get back is the data that we expected, plus for some reason removing the I's and the nays. We'll figure that out later. Because I didn't pass it into that post data. And you see now it's got an ID. So it did correctly create the object and returned it as part of the post response. Cool. Any questions? Yeah. Yep. Well, so this here, you're seeing this because you have debug equals true in your settings file, and somewhere up here that probably does say, hey, you probably meant, somewhere in this massive pile of raw HTML, it probably says you're missing a trailing slash. Yeah. There totally may have been. Generally speaking, any additional logging you want, you would have to add yourself. Yep, and there is something in the run server log about not having a slash, but we got to debug together, and that was a lovely experience. Cool. So we're going to move right along, and we're going to actually look at this page that we had again real quick. And I'm going to make this bigger so that people can kind of enjoy it in its full glory. So we have this what we call the, actually, I just realized, let's not show the bookmarks bar while we're doing this. We have this page, which is what they call the browsable API renderer. And when I say that, the question you might ask yourself is, what the heck is a renderer? A renderer is something that exists in Django, but also exists in Django REST-framework, and it's what we're going to use to really empower this idea that we can use the same view for both the API response and a rendered template response. The kind of default renderer, if you're accessing a Django REST-framework API, from, in an API context, like using a request or using curl, is the JSON renderer. And so let's talk about what a renderer does. A renderer takes a representation of the data which is in Python. In this case, this is actually taken from the request against the list endpoint. And what the Python view returns, quote unquote, is when it's fetching the data, it returns this Python representation. You see it's an ordered dict, which has some tuples in it, and it's like an ordered dict of ordered dict, which has a list of ordered dicts because there's some like pagination information that we're seeing here. And the renderer takes that and translates it into JSON. So you can see down below, it's like instead of it being a Python representation of Python objects, we now get this much simpler JSON representation of like JSON dicts and JSON lists. It might be the Python-like version of a JSON representation that is then like figured out in more depth later. What we're going to be using to make this happen is what's called the Django REST-framework template HTML renderer, where it takes that same internal Python representation and translates it into HTML using a template that we provided it. Similarly, there's the browsable API renderer, which is what we saw before, that takes that internal Python representation and renders it to a template that Django REST-framework controls. And so the big difference here is we want to be able to control the template. Briefly, just kind of talking about Django templating, because something like this is going to be very important for the next section. Django templating allows a lot of simple constructs like for loops and if statements. In the code that we're using, we shouldn't need any if statements, but we will need a for loop that looks very much like this. And this syntax of double curly braces for accessing things in the context. This hopefully looks familiar. If not, we can link to the Django templating documentation. There's one gotcha for how we're doing this, and I'm actually going to have people copy this right into their settings.py right now, because if you don't, you're going to get weird errors, and my goal is not to show you weird errors. This block needs to be somewhere in your settings.py. Doesn't really matter where. Generally speaking, towards the bottom is where people tend to put like user-specified configuration in settings.py. But let's talk about what this is doing and why this is a bit of a gotcha. When we move from that internal Python representation to an HTML context, the renderer needs to know how to translate this big ol' list of results from a query set into something that the front end can parse. And that means it needs to figure out how to kind of break it up into pages so that it only sends down a chunk at a time rather than trying to send down, Django REST-framework is built thinking that you're going to be building high velocity APIs that could have tens of thousands or millions of results in each query set, and so it needs to figure out how to paginate between them. For simplicity's sake, I am choosing page number pagination with a page size of 10. Django REST-framework is kind of cool that it comes with a whole bunch of default paginators. Another popular one is kind of cursor and page pagination, where it's like, here's a cursor that represents where you are in your page set, and like here's the cursor to the next page set. Page and offset is also a very popular paginator, but for today, the only one you need to worry about is page number pagination, and what that means is we can directly reference every page in our search results. There's some performance considerations there. If you care deeply about it, you can come talk to me afterwards. Everybody copied this? I can also put it on the next slide when we get to that point. Cool. Then the next pair exercise is to take what we've learned, and I will update this with some with the example code that I showed, so people are familiar with it. What we're going to do here, we're going to add a templates directory to our votes directory. We're going to add a vote list.html template to that templates directory. We're going to add a template HTML renderer to vote list's renderer classes, along with JSON renderer and browsable API renderer. We're going to point the template name of vote list to vote list.html. Oh, and I have this twice. I don't know why I have templates vote list HTML twice, but hooray! And then browse to votes and see the list the way that we would expect. So I'm going to put some sample code on this, and we're giving ourselves a nice chunk of time to do this. And the reason we're doing this is because there's more that I hope we'll have time to get to, but this is a lot of the magic is being able to control Django REST-framework's renderers to kind of selectively choose how you want the data represented when you request it. So give me a second and I will update this. I'm going to make that live in a second, but for now, you can look at the slide. Whoop, not that one. Cool. Also not that one. Yeah, definitely. Yep, nope, that's totally reasonable. Hopefully those pieces are enough to get people going. If not, don't hesitate to put up your red stickies. tutorial? Anybody parked on East Mall Drive? Okay. They're worried about cars getting towed, so I just wanted to call it out. But it sounds like that's no one's problem here. Carry on. but a couple people, I'll put the other slide back in just a minute. Some people mentioned running into an error when they try to render the template. You are going to get an error in your template if you do not have this in your settings.py. You just will. Pagination is not optional for this section, as it turns out. You must add this. If you haven't added this, please copy it now, because I'm about to move back to the other slide. Yeah, what's up? It should be results. If not, try votes. But I believe it's results. Almost positive it's results. Cool, I'm moving back to this slide. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, so that snippet there is going to look very similar to the snippet that you have for votes. It's going to be more like for vote in results / all those things. Great. When you do get to a point where you can see a rendered template with votes on it, that is enough for this section. So do put up a green sticky so we know if we can maybe move on a little earlier and get more of the content in. I'm seeing a lot of green stickies, which is great. If you've already finished, you're welcome to try to add some tests. You're welcome to try to play with different edge cases. We're probably going to give it another few minutes and then pick up for the next section. Okay, we're going to stop there and show code. I'm seeing a lot of green stickies, and a lot of people are having the same error. And so I want to show the code, because then we can all tackle this error at the same time. So 1 second. Cool. So let's take a look at the view that I got to. Move this out of the way. Great. Oh, fabulous. OK. So here is my views.py for this view. And so there's one thing I want to call out here, which some people discovered on their own. Some people I had the question, and so we're all going to tackle this together. We've got these renderer classes, and we've set the template name to a template. The thing about the renderer classes in a Django REST-framework API view is that order matters. And so the order that works best, in my experience, is to have the JSON renderer first, because most of your requests are going to be JSON API requests. Then have the template HTML renderer, and then have the browsable API renderer. And I had a great question. Why are we keeping the browsable API renderer around if we have this templated version? And the reason for that is that twofold. One, we can still get to the browsable API version with format equals API in the URL. And I'm also hoping we'll be able to get to a point in the tutorial where I'll show you how to make the browsable API renderer only available to staff users, so you can still use it as a debug if you need to. But for now, let's take a look at my vote_list.html, which again, I apologize. I'll see if I can try to get these side by side, but it might be a little tricky, especially since this LI is very long. Very, very long. Actually, we probably don't need the imports, right? Maybe we can just do the view? We'll find out. OK. Cool. And so this is what my votelist.html looks like. The more do not repeat yourself Django-ish way would maybe be to create a base template that captures the HTML and the bodywork. But for this tutorial, it's fine to just drop them right in. We're just kind of prototyping. And then for vote in results, and we get that results block because we've set a paginator. Otherwise, some of you saw that must be context, not return list error. Pagination is how we avoid that error. Iterate over the vote in this page of results and display some interesting relevant data. So in my case, I'm doing vote.subject, vote.eyes, vote.nays, on vote.taken. And so mine's going to look like, let me make sure that I have run server running somewhere interesting. Yes, I do. So I have this, and I'm just going to take off the format because what I would expect is, yep, great. So you can see that I have a list of my votes with some interesting relevant information. Right now these links don't really do anything because we haven't wired them up. But notably, I can still, if I want to do some debugging, do format equals like JSON. There's the full JSON blob. I could do format equals API. And because we're using the template HTML renderer, we have this new format, which is also our default view in a browser, which is format HTML. Cool. So we've done that, we've done that, we've done that. Great. And so briefly, why not use the browsable API render for everything? I kind of already talked about that. You have more control over a template that you own. You can totally override the browsable API renderer templates if you want to customize those instead. But I like keeping the browsable API renderer around as a debug tool for developers. So the next thing that we are going to do is to fully replicate the functionality. We're going to add a form to render the, add a form to the template to actually be able to create a vote. And for this one, there's nothing really like API specific about this. So I'm just going to kind of give you the code. I'm trying to think if there's a way that I can make it more copy-pastable, but like this is what needs to go into your. So we can just skip that as well. Again, all this is going to be available on GitHub. The one thing that's worth noting is this section here. So let's talk about this. This isn't necessary to move forward with the tutorial, so we're going to skip actually having you do this for time. But in your vote list view, you're going to override the create function. Like we had someone ask earlier, when would you override the functions that the generic list create API view provides? This is one of those cases. We're used to, with Django form views, having this idea of a redirect after the form successfully submits. We need to recreate a little bit of that functionality when we're using a Django REST-framework list API view. And so here we're getting what the response would be, the full response, and that it's really that line 3 there that is some of the magic. If request accepted renderer.format equals HTML. When your browser makes a request against the server, it is telling the server, hey, give me what lives at /votes, and also, I'd really like HTML back. So if you could give me HTML back, that would be great. And Django REST Framework captures that in the accepted renderer.format. And so if we've successfully created a vote with that response status code equals 201, and the accepted renderer format is HTML, then we return a redirect. We should go back to the list with our new vote created, like you might expect from a Django model form view. Otherwise, we just return the response because we're in JSON land and we should do what we would normally do. We're going to not do that for time, and instead I'm going to show you what that would look like. So give me just a second here and I will pull up that information. Yep, great. Good. Whoop. Git, what are you doing to me? Cool, great. And so now if we look at votelist.html, I'm going to make this a little bigger. You see that we now have a form that has this, is going to make post requests against the same endpoint that we were at with all of the fields. And then below, this is the same list that we had of vote results. And then I will show you the view and we'll see what that looks like all together. So let's close that for now and go look at the view. And so you see that I now have this create function that's overwriting the create that's provided by generics list create API view. And it's the same code that I showed you before where it's checking the accepted renderer, checking if we successfully created an object by the 201 return code, and it's returning a redirect so that we can see the vote that we just created. And so if I refresh this page, right. And so now I have this cool form, and if I were more design inclined or we have more time, I might make it look prettier or make it closer to the prototype that I'm trying to aim for, but instead I'm just going to go like, way in the future. Cool, and we see that it showed up down there. Any questions about that section? That's kind of another kind of like semi-tricky technical gotcha of like, how do we make a Django REST framework view operate kind of like a Django generic view? So any questions about that before we move on? Great, awesome. Cool. Now we get to do basically the same exercise, and so that's why we're going to have a little less time for it, and that is doing a vote detail view. The cool thing is we already have the links pointing at it in our vote list view, but now we need to actually wire those links up to a view that we create in our backend. To do that, we're going to use the second of the two generic views we're using for this tutorial, the retrieve, update, destroy API view. This is an example. You'll notice that it looks really similar to the vote list view that you created. And so this pair exercise is basically do the same thing that you just did, but instead of using a vote list view, use a vote detail view. So you've already got generics imported. Don't forget to add the renders. Don't forget to add that view to urls.py and make a vote detail template where this time the context object is going to be vote. So notice that the only difference between this and the vote list that you created is it's using a different generic. And I've called out what that generic is here. So try wiring up a vote detail view. We'll take 5 to 10 minutes to do this, and then we'll show the code for this. But it's going to look very, very similar to your vote list view. And if you have any questions, don't forget your red or green stickies. The code, again, is going to be like, you can effectively copy paste the class that you have and change the thing that it's inheriting from. So you already have a subclass of a generics view, the generic list create API view. This view is going to look basically the same with a different template name and a different class that it's inheriting from. I'm gonna put this back up. Don't worry, because I'm gonna add one thing that I think will help out. This is the line that you're going to need to add to your urls.py as kind of a hint for what else you might need to be doing here. Hey. Oh, turn the mic off. That line at the bottom of this slide is what's going to go into your urls.py. That is the exact line, and so that's kind of a hint of the view that you need to create as well. And notably, retrieved, update, destroy API view already knows to look for PK. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to do anything special there. I gave some bad advice a moment ago, and so I'm going to correct that advice. The variables that you might want to use to display a vote detail don't live under result or object or vote. They're just there. So like if you want to access subject, it's just subject, not vote.subject. If you feel like you've basically got it, please put up a green sticky. If you don't feel like you've got it, please take down your green sticky. Okay, I'm going to take this away for right now, and I'm going to show the code that I came up with, because it looks like we've got a rough consensus that the room has an idea of what to do. So let's start with my view. Oop, that's not at all what I wanted. Let's start with what I got from myviews.py. I'm going to pull that out over here. Come on, you. Where'd you go? There we are. Cool, so we're going to, that zoom thing. We're going to skip vote list, because we've done that. But if you notice, if I were to collapse this create function, then vote list and vote detail actually look really similarly, and that's kind of by design, right? The magic is more the difference in the template name and the difference in the class that we're inheriting from. Retrieve, update, destroy API view already knows how to operate on just one object versus operating on a list of objects. And so you might look at this and think, hey, there's a lot of like boilerplate here. We could probably copy this into a mixin, right? If we have time, I'm hoping we can get to that, because I have some ideas on how to make a nice mixin for these views that we've created. However, for now, let's look at what I got from my, well, you've already kind of seen my urls.py, but it's worth showing again. So still pretty straightforward, admin votes, and now we have this votes with an int to reference just one vote. That was on the slide, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And then we have this new HTML file we created in our HTML files in this shockingly large text editor window called vote.html. And this is what mine looks like. Yours might look completely different, and that's totally fine. Great. It turns out that browsers are totally fine with you not calling an HTML document HTML. The browser's going to try real hard to render it correctly anyways. Cool. Oh, yeah, yes, great. Generally speaking, one, I'm actually a little impressed that worked. Two, the way that I think about the query set object, sorry, the query set reference on an API view in Django REST Framework is you were telling Django REST Framework, this is the total possible set of objects that this view could operate on. Right, so that list, that first list view, let's say that our vote, we had 1,000 votes in our query set. It's that our detail view is only going to return 10 at a time because we only told it to return 10 at a time. So even though we told it query set.all, it's only going to take 10 chunks. Similarly with the detail view, I'll go back to this real quick. Similarly with the detail view, you know, I'm showing it. What happened? I'm giving it the .all. But what that's telling Django REST Framework is this is the total set of things you could operate on, but you're probably only going to operate on one because it's a retrieve, update, destroy API view. It's a detail view. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. Any other questions before we move on? Great. Let's bring back our slides. So where are we? We have gotten to that. We have about realistically 15 minutes. So yeah, let's talk about authentication real quick. And if we can get through authentication, I think we'll have done quite a lot. So similarly to the way that Django REST Framework has lovely built-in classes for handling things like templates and rendering and fetching things from the database, it also has some lovely built-in classes for authentication. And the real way to think about authentication in an API is who do you care can read versus who do you care can write. Most APIs that you may have designed yourselves or worked with in the past as third parties probably had different permissions based on whether you were reading an API endpoint or writing to an API endpoint. And Django REST Framework supports this very well in a way that we're going to see shortly. But I just want to call out that Django REST Framework has a ton of authentication options. Here's a couple. You can do session auth, which is what you might be, that uses your Django session cookie, your logged in session cookie, as an authentication mechanism and kind of ties into Django's built-in auth. There is token auth, which kind of works like a session cookie, but it's a token that is stored in the database and generated by Django REST Framework that you kind of control the generation of. And then there's OAuth, which we could have spent this entire 3 hours talking about how OAuth works, and we would have all learned a ton of things, and it would have been great. But suffice to say, OAuth is probably something that you will need to implement or use in an API at some point. There's some books and resources I can recommend for digging into it, but we just don't have time in this tutorial. Maybe next year I'll do a follow-up version of this that does OAuth. So those Django REST Framework breaks its kind of authentication system into two parts: authentication classes and permission classes. Authentication classes are how do you identify, how does a user say, yes, I am this user? And permission classes is great. Now that I have a user, what can this user do on the API? And so when I talked about authentication, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on a permissions class, which is going to have a confusing name, and I apologize in advance, because its permissions is authenticated or read-only. And so it's kind of mixing the metaphors there. But what this is doing is we are going to have, and I'll put up some code samples after I'm done with this to give you a starting point, to both of our view classes, we're going to add a permission, I think it's permission classes variable that is going to contain permissions.isAuthenticated or read-only. And what that's going to mean is if you are an anonymous user, and we can test this by opening an anonymous browser window and trying to view or create things, if you're an anonymous user, you can read everything there is, but if you try to update it, you're going to get back a 400, some sort of 400 error, either a 401 or a 403. Basically, the API is going to say, nope, you're not authenticated, you can't do this. If you are authenticated, like you're logged in to Django, and logging into the admin panel counts as being logged into Django, by the way, then you'll still be able to create votes as you want. So I'm going to take a couple seconds to add some sample code to this so that we can have a starting point. And then this is basically probably the last pair exercise we're going to get to today, and then we'll kind of do a debrief before we exit. So hold on one second. I'm going to add some code. If you want to take a stab at it, the variable is, you can see the kind of link there to adding the permission classes, but I'm going to show an example as well. Wow. It looks like modern art, but it's actually some sample code to add to your views. And so the thing to note here is that permission classes that I've added, and also the import from REST framework permissions. And then one way to test this is to open an anonymous browser in Chrome or Firefox and browse to that endpoint and try adding a vote. Say again? You can use the browsable API renderer by going to question format equals API, and that permission will still apply to the browsable API renderer. In fact, here. Da, 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 da. Cool. So for this, even to test the permissions, because we didn't have time to add the create form fully to our template, go to the browsable API renderer, the permission will still apply. And then while we're doing that, I'm going to pass out some pens. Huh? Okay, never mind. If you want to log in to test, you might already be logged in on your existing session because logging in through admin counts. Right. If you need to log in again, go to /admin again, and it'll make you log in, and now you'll be logged in. If I could get a show of green stickies for done or not done, that would be rad. Now, test, now, great, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to show you the code that I had to get this done, but I'm going to show you a slightly different form that is hopefully going to make some amount of sense. We're going to find out right now. Git check cool, perfect. So remember how I said earlier that, boy, it looks like there's a lot of boilerplate. Maybe we could do something about that. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm gonna show you the final form of my views.py file. I'm going to close this create function, though, because it's not necessary. You notice that now my vote list and my vote detail are basically one line, if we ignore this create because we skipped that. They're basically one line, and that's because I've pulled all of the relevant boilerplate into this renderer class, into this mixin, and I've added a couple things that are less important to notice about, but like because these were basically all going to be the same for both views, rather than duplicating that code, I can pull that code into a mixin and have both of the views inherit from the mixin. Don't worry about copying this down. Again, it'll be available in the repo that I'm going to post. But this is because when I see multiple classes that are sharing the same boilerplate, I think to myself, why write the boilerplate twice when I can only write it once? And this little kind of nugget here is one way of making sure that the browsable API renderer, which is more of a debug view than necessarily like a public-facing view, is only available to staff, which is kind of neat. GetRenders is a function that the generic views are calling internally, and so here we're overwriting it. With that, there's obviously so much more that we could cover on this topic, but we are more or less out of time for today because I want to make sure to get you out of here on time for lunch. I will be available for a little bit to answer questions, and I will send out an email to the class list with a link to the slides and a link to the GitHub repo. Let me see. What is going on? Okay. Do I have a... Yep, great. This is me. You're always welcome to send me an email. I am at Phildini on Twitter, or if you're into Mastodon, that is my Mastodon address. I'm going to stick around for a bit to answer questions. One thing I would ask, thank you me for reminding me. There is a survey that I'm going to type up here and that PyCon would like you to fill out if you don't mind. And then if you're feeling especially generous, take the sticky notes that you have been given and used throughout this class, come up to the table where Ashish and Al are standing, and write on the green sticky note one thing you liked, and on the red sticky note one thing you think could be improved about this tutorial, and we'll take that feedback for the next time that we give it. But if you also want to fill out this survey, this is for helping PyCon and me. The sticky notes are more just for helping me. Thank you all so much. I want to call out that in about 3 hours, you went from nothing to a working Django API app with rendering your own templates. So give yourselves a round of applause for getting that far. Are there any big picture questions that people have right now? Yeah. How does all the generic stuff affect performance? In my experience, no better or worse than code you would write yourself, and in fact, possibly slightly better because there are teams of open source engineers who have spent time trying to make sure that it's performant, whereas your code might be performant, might be more performant, but you would have to do that testing for yourself, right, to figure out if your code is going to be more performant than the code written by the framework. Did I see a question up here? If you have questions specific to your code, I can answer those out of band, but it's more kind of like general questions. Anyone have any last general questions? If you just can't get enough of myself and Ashish, we're going to be giving a talk tomorrow at 5 p.m. on timing attacks. You can learn about how you can implement something completely correctly and still have it be vulnerable, which is always fun. And if you just can't get enough of Al has enough books to fill this room that he's written, many of which are available through No Starch Press, which you can find in the expo hall the rest of this weekend.
Yeah, I'll be there Saturday at noon to 1, and also probably throughout the conference. And if you want to leave them on your sticky notes, you didn't bring a pen, come here, you can borrow a pen. We just have to make sure these get back to the conference website.
Thank you all so much. Enjoy lunch and enjoy the rest of PyCon.